right? So here's something your history teacher almost certainly left out. On the night of August 15, 1953, a group of American intelligence officers were huddled inside a safe house in Tehran, and they were drinking vodka, sloshing it down, actually singing Broadway songs at full volume, waiting for confirmation that they had just rearranged the political future of an entire sovereign nation. Their favorite song that night, and this is documented, this is in the historical record, was "Luck Be a Lady Tonight" from the musical Guys and Dolls. It had been playing on a loop for weeks. It was apparently their theme song for the whole operation. And then the news came back. It had failed. The man they were trying to remove from power had been tipped off. He had moved against their operatives, sent them running. The plan was in pieces. Headquarters sent an urgent cable to the man running the operation, a 37-year-old named Kermit Roosevelt Jr., telling him in plain language, "Get out of Iran now before they find you." He read the cable, and he ignored it. 4 days later, nearly 300 people had lost their lives on the streets of Tehran. The democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran was fleeing through his garden wall in his pajamas, and Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of an American president, was quietly celebrating what his superiors would later call the CIA's first great triumph. If you think the world you're living in today has nothing to do with what happened in those 4 days in August 1953, then stay with me. Because I think you might be wrong about that. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and drop a comment. I read every single one. Now let's go back to where this actually starts. Okay. So the year is 1901, and a man named William D. Arcey is sitting in London with a very specific kind of greed and theory about the ground beneath Persia. Darcy had already made himself rich pulling gold out of Australian rock, and he understood with the clarity of someone who has done it before that the real money is never in what you produce. The real money is in who owns the ground you produce it from. He went to the Persian Shah Mozaffar ad-Din, who was drowning in debt, whose government was disintegrating, and who needed cash immediately. Darcy offered him £20 in cash, another 20 in shares, and 16% of future profits in exchange for the exclusive right to drill for oil across 480 square miles of Iranian territory. That is, for context, a concession roughly the size of modern France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined, for £20 and a promise of 16%. The Shah signed. Darcy spent 7 years drilling, nearly went bankrupt twice in the process, and then in May 1908, his crew struck oil in the southwestern province of Khuzestan. It was the first major oil discovery in the entire Middle East. 1 year later, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born. The British government, recognizing immediately what it was sitting on, acquired a controlling stake. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, famously converted the entire Royal Navy from coal to oil in 1913, making Iranian production not merely valuable but a matter of national military survival. Now here is the thing that I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of this story. By the late 1940s, the British government was extracting somewhere between $170 and $200 million worth of Iranian oil every single year, and Iran's share of that, after the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had finished with its accounting, was rarely more than 16 million. Sometimes less. The refinery at Abadan on the banks of the Shatt al-Arab waterway had become, by the 1930s, the largest oil processing facility in the world, and it was surrounded by a British colonial town complete with club swimming pools and a policy that explicitly barred Iranians from entering certain buildings. The Iranian workers at Abadan were classified as unskilled labor regardless of their actual qualifications, because classifying them otherwise would mean paying them more, and there was no contract clause requiring anyone to pay more. I want you to think about that for a moment. You are an Iranian engineer. You are working at the largest refinery on the planet on your own country's soil with your own country's oil. And you are not allowed into certain buildings. That specific combination of proximity and exclusion, that is not just an economic arrangement. That is a psychological condition, and it produces over decades a specific and very durable kind of fury. Into this arrangement, in the spring of 1951, walked Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, Mossadegh is one of those historical figures that the West spent 70 years trying to make you forget, and I think that is actually telling. He was not a simple man, and he was not a revolutionary in the romantic barricades and rifles sense. He was 69 years old. He was an aristocrat. He had a doctorate in law from Switzerland, had studied in Paris, had served in the Iranian parliament on and off for 30 years. He had voted against Reza Shah's seizure of absolute power in 1925, which cost him years of enforced house confinement. He had blocked Soviet oil concession attempts in 1944, which made him enemies in Moscow. He was, in other words, not anyone's puppet, not anyone's useful tool, which is exactly what made him so threatening. What he did in April 1951 was put the question of Iranian oil to a parliamentary vote. The vote was unanimous. Every single member of the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. The oil belonged to Iran. Full stop. And the world noticed. Time magazine named him Person of the Year for 1951, ahead of Churchill, ahead of General Eisenhower, ahead of everyone. Before Nasser, before Castro, before any of the Third World nationalist leaders who would come to define the second half of the 20th century, Mossadegh was the man who stood up in front of the old colonial order and said, actually, no, this is ours. You can have it back now. The British response was predictably total war by other means. They organized a global embargo on Iranian oil so comprehensive that Iran could not sell a single barrel anywhere on earth. They froze Iranian financial assets held in British banks. They sent warships to the Persian Gulf. And they began lobbying Washington persistently to join them in getting rid of Mossadegh, framing him in every cable and briefing as a communist fellow traveler whose nationalism was just Soviet expansionism with better tailoring. President Truman, to his credit, did not buy this. His envoy Averell Harriman flew to Tehran, met with Mossadegh, came back and told Washington plainly, this man is a nationalist, not a communist, and Iran's grievances are legitimate. The British were politely told to find a different solution. And then in January 1953, Dwight Eisenhower moved into the White House. And the whole calculation changed, right? So this is the part where it gets complicated and frankly somewhat extraordinary. Eisenhower brought to Washington two brothers who would become arguably the most consequential pair of siblings in Cold War history. John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, Allen Dulles running the CIA. Both had spent their formative professional years as partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of Wall Street's premier law firms, whose client list included several of the world's largest oil companies. I am not suggesting that is the only reason they did what they did, but I am suggesting it is not irrelevant. The British, who had been pitching the Americans on this operation for over a year and getting turned down, finally found their audience. The CIA allocated an initial budget of $1 million. Some records suggest the eventual total reached $7 million with instructions to use it, and I am quoting the internal CIA memorandum here, in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. The man they sent to Tehran was Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Now look, Kermit Roosevelt is one of those figures where if you put him in a film, people would say the character was too on the nose. He is the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. He speaks neither Arabic nor Farsi. He attended Harvard. He describes himself in his memoir as having once dined with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on the same afternoon as a matter of routine. His colleagues described him as soft-spoken, mild-mannered, the sort of chap you would not look at twice in an airport. One British double agent who knew him personally said he was the last person you'd expect to be up to his neck in dirty tricks. He entered Iran in July 1953 under a false passport, listed as a man named James Lockridge, traveling by a circuitous route through Beirut and Iraq, switching vehicles multiple times at the border. And from a rented house in Tehran, he began methodically and without particular haste dismantling one of the few functioning democracies in the Middle East. His approach had three distinct layers, and I think each one is worth understanding because the same methodology has been used in more countries than you probably want to know about. The first layer was information. Within 2 weeks of Roosevelt's arrival, approximately 80% of Tehran's major newspapers had been financially brought into line. Editors received envelopes. Columnists filed stories. The stories said Mossadegh was corrupt, a communist planning to abolish the monarchy and deliver Iran to Moscow. None of it was true. All of it ran on the front pages. Every morning, Iranians picked up their papers and read a version of a man they had been cheering 6 months earlier redrawn so thoroughly that they barely recognized him. The second layer was institutional. Members of Mossadegh's own parliamentary coalition began denouncing him in public in language that seemed from the outside like the natural fragmentation of a political alliance under pressure. Ayatollah Kashani, the most powerful religious figure in Mossadegh's support base, turned against him, completely issuing public condemnations with what one historian later described as the vitriol he had once reserved for the British. Where the financial inducements for this reversal came from, the CIA's own declassified records on this point remain redacted to this day. The third layer was the street. And this is the part that, in my view, has never been adequately reckoned with. Roosevelt hired professional agitators, wrestlers, market strongmen, including a man named Shaban Jafari, known across Tehran as Shaban, the brainless who led networks of professional intimidators that you could deploy anywhere in the city for the right price. He paid crowds to march for the Shah. He paid different crowds to march against religion dressed as Mossadegh supporters, attacking mosques, burning sacred imagery, specifically designed to make average Iranians believe that Mossadegh's government had lost control of public order. He even, and this is documented in his own memoir, paid operatives to assault symbols of the Shah while shouting pro-Mossadegh slogans, calculating that watching their king's portrait being defaced by men claiming to support the prime minister would turn ordinary Iranians against him. The manufactured and the genuine became in the streets of Tehran that summer completely indistinguishable, which was entirely the point. But here is the hitch that nobody much talks about. Roosevelt needed one more thing. He needed the Shah himself to sign the royal decrees that would make this legal, or at least give it the appearance of legality. And the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, at 33 years old, was, let's be charitable and say, constitutionally cautious. He had been placed on the peacock throne at 22 by Allied occupying forces who needed a compliant figurehead during the war, and compliance had defined his entire governing philosophy. He was not a man who made bold decisions. He was a man who needed to be told what the decision already was and then told several more times. The CIA actually sent his twin sister, Princess Ashraf, who'd been living in Europe on a secret mission, back to Tehran specifically to press her brother to cooperate. They also sent General Norman Schwarzkopf, yes, the father of the general who commanded Desert Storm in 1991, but at this point a man who had spent years training Iranian security forces and had a personal relationship with the Shah on a cover trip through the Middle East with a stop in Tehran. He met with the Shah in a Grand Palace ballroom where the two sat at a small table in the very center of the room because the Shah was convinced the walls were bugged. And then Roosevelt himself was smuggled into the royal palace, under a blanket, in the back seat of a car, multiple times, sitting across from the Shah in private apartments, speaking in that quiet, unhurried way of his that gave the impression, as a colleague later recalled, of someone who had just had lunch with the American president. He told the Shah what was going to happen. He told the Shah what the United States was prepared to do and support. He told the Shah what he needed to sign. On August 13, 1953, the Shah signed 2 royal decrees. One dismissing Mossadegh, one appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi, who had incidentally collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War, as the new prime minister. Then the Shah flew to Baghdad. Then he flew to Rome. He was, by his own later admission, certain he had gambled and lost. He was almost right. The first attempt on August 15 collapsed within hours. Mossadegh had been informed. He moved against the conspirators. The CIA officer sent to deliver the dismissal decree was himself apprehended. Roosevelt received the cable from Langley: abort leave immediately. It is over. He set it aside and went back to work. He spent 4 days in the house smoking, swimming in a small indoor pool, playing Luck Be a Lady on the gramophone, and reworking the entire plan from scratch. He spread a fabricated account that Mossadegh himself had staged the first operation, that he had attempted to seize the throne, that the Shah had fled for his own safety. This false version ran in all the CIA-funded newspapers the following morning. On August 19, the 1953 before dawn, the buses began bringing people into the city center. Some had been financially engaged in advance. Some were genuine royalists who had believed the newspapers. Some were religious figures whose cooperation had been secured through an Ayatollah named Behbahani, who served as a conduit for CIA funds into the religious establishment. By noon, the streets were full. Between these organized crowds and the army units whose officers had been financially redirected toward the new government, the balance shifted. And then the tanks came. The confrontation around Mossadegh's official residence lasted less than 2 hours. Shellfire hit the exterior walls. His guards were overwhelmed. He escaped through the back of the house, spent one night in hiding, and surrendered the next morning. He was brought before a military tribunal on charges of treason. He conducted his own defense for 6 weeks with a precision that reportedly exhausted every member of the court. When the verdict was finally announced, 3 years in isolated detention, not the maximum sentence the prosecution had demanded, Mossadegh looked up from his notes and said with a composure the journalists present found genuinely unsettling: the verdict of this court has increased my historical glories. I am extremely grateful you convicted me. Tonight, the Iranian nation understood the meaning of constitutionalism. Okay. Take a moment with that sentence. Now, here is where I want to offer my own view, because I think the history here is more complicated than the simple story of American villainy, and it is more honest to say so. There is a respected piece in Foreign Affairs magazine by historian Ray Taki arguing that the CIA's actual operational contribution to what happened on August 19 was, in his word, insignificant. That the crowds who brought down Mossadegh were genuine Iranians with genuine grievances, not puppets on American strings. That Roosevelt's memoir was self-aggrandizing fiction, and the CIA has been given credit, or rather blamed, for something that Iranian political dynamics would have produced anyway. And, look, I think there is something to that argument. I genuinely do. Mossadegh had lost the support of the religious establishment, his coalition was fracturing, the British embargo had devastated the Iranian economy, and the conditions for his removal did not exist solely because one American had arrived with a suitcase of cash. But here's what I cannot get around. The CIA's own declassified documents, the ones released in 2013, 60 years after the fact, confirmed the operation in operational detail. The infrastructure of disinformation, the financial networks, the organized presence on the streets. And most importantly, Kermit Roosevelt received a direct order to stand down, and he chose not to. What happened on August 19 was shaped, accelerated, and made inevitable by that choice. Whether it would have happened anyway without him is a question we cannot answer, because it didn't happen without him. What we can say is this: the CIA considered Operation Ajax a resounding success. So much so that Eisenhower secretly awarded Roosevelt the National Security Medal in 1954. And the methodology: fabricate a domestic crisis, financially redirect key institutions, deploy organized crowds to generate the appearance of popular demand for change, was exported almost immediately to Guatemala, to Indonesia, to Chile, to a catalog of countries whose internal politics were rearranged over the following 3 decades by men who had learned the lesson of Tehran. After the operation, Roosevelt left Iran. He returned to Washington and gave Eisenhower a personal briefing that by all accounts left the president leaning forward in his chair, asking how exactly one goes about purchasing the political future of a nation. Then Roosevelt left the CIA in 1958 and went to work for American defense companies, including Northrop Corporation, which paid him $75 a year to facilitate arms sales to the Shah's government, the same government he had installed. He visited Tehran regularly. He and the Shah remained on cordial terms. He died in the year 2000 at a retirement community in Cockeysville, Maryland, and his 50-year Harvard reunion report described his life as satisfactory, often exciting, and appropriately proud. In Tehran, the Shah built what his American sponsors had designed for him. SAVAK, The state security apparatus established in 1957 with CIA funding and a training program run by CIA officers who set up instruction facilities in a government building and taught courses in surveillance and what the curriculum simply called technical methods, became within a decade what Amnesty International's 1976 report described as one of the most systematic violators of civil liberties anywhere in the world. More than 300 Iranians passed through its detention network. An average of 500 people were taken in every month. And Mossadegh, after 3 years in isolated detention, he was driven to Ahmadabad, his ancestral village, 120 kilometers from Tehran. There was a 2-story brick house behind a 3-meter metal gate. The soldiers stationed permanently outside were not his. He was told he was under house confinement. He was not told when it would end. He wrote in a private memoir found after his passing, "Even now I am still under guard, and since they will not let me out of this fortress without an escort, I have chosen to remain in it and have nothing else to do but submit to this fate and wait for my life to end so I could liberate myself." His wife passed away in 1965. In the autumn of 1966, he developed a painful swelling on the left side of his face. When his son arranged for a surgeon to make the trip to Ahmadabad and the surgeon told him he hoped to have good news about the biopsy results, Mossadegh replied, "And I want you to understand that this is a documented quote, that this is a real thing, a real person said at the end of a real life, I hope. It is cancer. I'm tired of this loneliness and this life." It was cancer. The Shah himself had to grant written permission for Mossadegh to leave the village for treatment. On the dawn of March 5, 1967, he fell into a coma in the hospital his own mother had built decades earlier. He passed away that same morning. He had asked to be buried in a public cemetery beside the men who had stood for him in 1952. The Shah said no. He was buried without ceremony in the living room of his house in Ahmadabad behind the metal gate. A caretaker there told a journalist some years later why visits are still discouraged by the current government. They do not want people to know he is here to arouse nationalism again. The Shah was forced from power in February 1979. 26 years. That is how long the arrangement purchased in August 1953 lasted before the accumulated pressure of everything it had produced came due. The hostage crisis, the 444 days, the rescue attempt that ended in a desert sandstorm with 8 American servicemen claiming the wreckage left burning on the sand, the revolution, the wars, the decades of proxy conflict of sanctions of a Middle East whose modern shape was drawn in considerable part in a Cyprus conference room in the summer of 1953. Stephen Kinzer, the New York Times journalist who wrote the definitive account of these events, put it in terms I think deserve to be quoted here. "It is not far-fetched," he wrote, "to draw a line from Operation Ajax through the Shah's repressive regime and the Islamic Revolution to the fireballs that engulfed the World Trade Center in New York." Now that is a large claim, and you are welcome to disagree with it. But I would ask you to sit with the chain of events, and then ask yourself whether the people in that conference room in Cyprus in 1953 who were confident they were making a smart, low-cost, efficient decision, whether they had any idea what they were buying. $1 million. 4 days. One country. Kermit Roosevelt called it a triumph. He wrote that in a memoir. He sold it for $12.95. Second-hand copies go for about $100 now. A few are signed by the author. Iran has not had a democratic government since August 19, 1953. If this story made you think differently about what you were taught in school or what you were not taught, share it with someone who should know it. The comments section is open. I read every single one.